Welcome to Hollywood Secrets Information. And in this video, we are going to explore some of the most extreme R-rated fantasy movies of the 1980s that shocked audiences and even the studios that released them. The 1980s was a wild decade for cinema. Studios were experimenting with darker storytelling, edgy humor, and imaginative worlds that pushed the boundaries of what fantasy films could show on screen. While many fantasy movies today are designed for family audiences, the 80s often blended magic with violence, horror, dark satire, and adult themes. Some of these films became cult classics, while others sparked controversy, confused critics, or left audiences stunned. So today, we're diving into 10 unforgettable fantasy films from the 1980s that dare to go too far and change the genre forever. 1. Excalibur, 1981. When this epic Arthurian tale arrived in 1981, fantasy films were usually toned down for family audiences. But director John Boorman took a completely different approach. Excalibur presented the legend of King Arthur with raw medieval brutality, mystical imagery, and mature storytelling, earning it a firm R rating. The film shocked audiences with its intense battle scenes and darker interpretation of the classic myth. During the 1980s, studios were beginning to test how far fantasy storytelling could go, and Excalibur became one of the earliest examples of fantasy aimed squarely at adults. Behind the scenes, many young actors who later became famous appeared in the film, including Liam Neeson and Patrick Stewart. Today, its tone might still be possible, but major studios often prefer more family-friendly fantasy franchises rather than such grim, mythological storytelling. 2. Conan the Barbarian, 1982. The success of Conan the Barbarian helped redefine fantasy cinema in the early 80s. Starring Arnold Schwarzenegger, the film embraced a gritty world inspired by the stories of Robert E. Howard. Unlike later fantasy adventures filled with humor and lighthearted heroes, Conan the Barbarian delivered a darker tone with intense action, revenge themes, and mythological violence. This mature style gave it an R rating and shocked audiences who expected a more traditional fantasy adventure. Behind the scenes, the production was physically demanding, with actors performing difficult stunts and training extensively with swords. In today's film industry, many studios might soften such material to appeal to broader audiences. But in the 80s, filmmakers were willing to take bigger creative risks. 3. The Beastmaster, 1982. Another cult fantasy from the early 80s was The Beastmaster, starring Mark Singer. The film mixed adventure, supernatural powers, and darker fantasy elements that made it stand out from family-oriented fantasy films of the time. The movie became controversial because of its unusual tone, combining heroic storytelling with intense battles and eerie magical creatures. During the early VHS era, it gained massive popularity through cable television and home video. Interestingly, some studios initially worried the film was too strange and intense for mainstream audiences, but its cult following proved otherwise. Today, the fantasy genre often focuses on massive CGI spectacles, whereas the Beastmaster relied heavily on practical effects and creative filmmaking techniques. 4. Fire and Ice, 1983. Fire and Ice was a unique animated fantasy collaboration between director Ralph Bakshi and legendary fantasy artist Frank Frazetta. The film's visual style was groundbreaking, using a technique called rotoscoping to trace live-action performances into animation. But what shocked audiences wasn't just the animation. It was the film's mature tone and intense fantasy battles. In the 1980s, this kind of adult-oriented animation was extremely rare in theaters. While the film has since gained a loyal cult audience, studios today might approach the material differently, possibly softening the tone or expanding it into a streaming series rather than a theatrical release. Point 5. Heavy Metal, 1981. Released the same year, Heavy Metal shocked audiences for a completely different reason. This animated anthology blended science fiction, fantasy, and adult storytelling, something rarely seen in mainstream animation at the time. Inspired by the famous magazine Heavy Metal Magazine, the film included dark humor, violent fantasy battles, and surreal storytelling that pushed animation into adult territory. During the 1980s, animation was still widely associated with children's entertainment. That's why this R-rated animated fantasy surprised many moviegoers and even made some studios hesitant about similar projects. Today, adult animation is more common thanks to shows and films aimed at mature audiences. But in 1981, Heavy Metal felt like a rebellious experiment that helped open the door for more mature animated storytelling. 6. Ladyhawke, 1985. Directed by Richard Donner, Ladyhawke combined romance, magic, and darker fantasy elements. Starring Matthew Broderick, Rutger Hauer, and Michelle Pfeiffer, the film told a tragic story about lovers cursed by dark magic. While not as graphic as some other films on this list, the movie still carried mature themes and dramatic storytelling that pushed fantasy into more emotional territory. During the 1980s, studios were experimenting with combining fantasy with adult drama. Today, similar stories often appear in television series or streaming productions rather than standalone films, showing how the industry's approach to fantasy storytelling has evolved. 7. Highlander, 1986. Few fantasy films from the 80s achieved the cult status of Highlander. Starring Christopher Lambert and Sean Connery, the movie introduced audiences to immortal warriors battling across centuries. Its intense sword fights and dramatic mythology helped earn the film an R rating. At the time, studios weren't sure audiences would connect with such a strange concept, immortals secretly fighting through history. However, the film's unique premise and iconic soundtrack by Queen helped turn it into a cult phenomenon. Today, Hollywood often turns these types of stories into large cinematic universes. But Highlander proved a single bold idea could leave a lasting impact. 8. The Witches of Eastwick, 1987. This supernatural fantasy comedy starred Jack Nicholson, Cher, Susan Sarandon, and Michelle Pfeiffer. Based on the novel by John Updike, the film explored themes of power, temptation, and supernatural influence. Its edgy humor and dark magical themes made it stand out from typical fantasy films in the cultural climate of the 1980s. This mix of satire and supernatural storytelling sparked plenty of debate. Today, similar themes might be presented differently to match changing cultural expectations, but the film remains an important example of fantasy blending with adult satire. 9. Hell Comes to Frogtown, 1988. One of the strangest cult fantasy films of the decade was Hell Comes to Frogtown, starring wrestler-turned-actor Roddy Piper. Set in a bizarre post-apocalyptic world, the film mixed fantasy elements with action and satire. Its unusual premise and over-the-top humor made it both controversial and fascinating for audiences at the time. During the 1980s, independent filmmakers often pushed boundaries that major studios avoided. While the movie's tone might be approached differently today, it remains a memorable example of the experimental storytelling that defined the decade. 10. The Adventures of Baron Munchausen, 1988, directed by visionary filmmaker Terry Gilliam. The Adventures of Baron Munchausen became famous for its imaginative visuals and chaotic production history. The film pushed fantasy to surreal extremes, blending humor, adventure, and elaborate visual effects. However, the production faced major budget problems and studio disagreements, making it one of the most challenging films of the decade. Despite its troubled release, the movie later gained cult status for its creativity. Today, such a risky and expensive fantasy project might struggle to get studio approval without a major franchise attached. The 1980s was truly a golden age of experimental fantasy filmmaking. Directors were willing to take bold, creative risks, studios experimented with darker storytelling, and audiences experienced fantasy worlds unlike anything they had seen before. Many of these films shocked viewers when they were first released, but over time, they became beloved cult classics that helped shape modern fantasy cinema. Which of these extreme 80s fantasy movies surprised you the most? Let us know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed exploring these forgotten cinematic worlds, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Hollywood Secrets Information, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another deep dive into Hollywood history.